Hello, good morning. Welcome to Psychiatry Grand Rounds for today. We'll go ahead and get started because we have a really good presentation to look forward to. Today, I would really like to give a very warm welcome to Dr. Raj Sevak. Dr. Sevak received his Ph.D. From the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio, specifically with the Department of Pharmacology. He is currently a fellow and adjunct faculty member here at ETSU with the College of Pharmacy, and he has been here since July of last year. Prior to becoming here, he was a faculty member with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of California at Los Angeles from June 2009 to 2014. I know to me what really struck me in his resume was just the amount of research and grants that he's received. He's an expert on a number of things. Most recently, he funded by the NIH, human methamphetamine self-administration in a progressive ratio paradigm. Also previously funded from the Friends Research Institute, where he was looking at the effects of buspirone on cardiovascular and subjective effects of IV methamphetamine in amphetamine-dependent humans. Past projects include projects related to smoking cessation and lisdexamphetamine for methamphetamine dependence. So I know I'm really looking forward to the presentation. Thanks for being with us today, Dr. Sevak.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks for... Can you hear me better now? Okay. Thanks for the very gracious introduction. Appreciate it. I'm currently working in College of Pharmacy. I'm a fellow and adjunct faculty. Today I'm going to talk about abuse potential of prescription stimulant medications such as Adderall, Ritalin, Vyvanse, comparison with street stimulants such as methamphetamine, cocaine. A good part of, well, before I begin, let me go for the disclosure statement. I do not have any financial interest arrangements or affiliation with one or more organizations, and no conflict of interest in the context of this presentation. So let me mention that a good part of this research was conducted at UCLA, Ronald Reagan Medical Center, where inpatient studies were conducted, and this office in Summer Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. And what did I do? Okay. And at the University of Kentucky Chandler Medical Center. So let me give you a brief background on the topic. We all know that abuse and misuse of prescription stimulants is a big problem, according to latest survey on National Survey on Drug Use in Household, that have shown that approximately 7 million, I'm trying to get used to this device, approximately 7 million Americans 12 years or older have used or abused prescription medications such as hydrocodone, oxycodone, and number of prescription drug abusers are second only to marijuana abusers, and CDC has considered prescription drug abuse as an epidemic. So the magnitude is very intense, but also consequences are the number of drug emergency department visits and overdose deaths have been reported. So we all know that opioids are the major class of drugs which are prescription drugs and that are abused, but prescription stimulants like D-amphetamine, methylphenidate are also very highly misused and abused. As a matter of fact, this NISDA data have shown that prescription stimulant abusers are twice as many as methamphetamine abusers. And there is a popular perception that prescription stimulants don't pose as much as of an abuse potential as street stimulants. And there's a halo behind these drugs and these FDA-approved drugs, and they're supposed to be very safe. And they are to an extent, as long as they are taken as per the medical advice, but a lot of people don't. And the negative health consequences tend to be severe. So the test data have shown that emergency department visits related to ADHD stimulant medications have almost tripled from 13,000 to 31,000 a year. And these visits were by people who were age 18 and older. And half of these visits were due to non-medical use of stimulants. So despite this strong results and alarming rates, So very little has been done to examine its abuse potential or what factors really affect abuse of prescription stimulants. And part of the reason being that there's a huge perception that these drugs do not have very high potential for abuse. And but before we carefully examine that, let's put them on table and carefully look at all those drugs together. Let's look at the structure to begin with. These drugs are phenylethylamine derivatives. So there's an phenyl group, there's an ethyl group, and there's an amine group. So phenylethylamine creates a backbone structure of these drugs. There's diamphetamine. If you look at methamphetamine, it has very similar structure. And so does methylphenidate with some variation in structure. So they have very similar structural profile. And interestingly, this similarity in structural profile also translates into functional profile as well. This similar in structure, they bind to certain proteins in brain, which are dopamine transporters. So that's a dopamine transporter right there. That's a presynaptic neuron. That's a synapse. And that's a postsynaptic neuron. It's a dopamine receptors. So this drug binds selectively to dopamine transporter and also other monoamine transporters, norepinephrine transporter, serotonin transporter with different affinities. But as such, this monoamine transporter, the action on this transporter increases synaptic levels of monoamines, primarily dopamine, that enhances postsynaptic signal of these medications that most commonly relate to the reward-related effects or euphoria. So we saw something similarity in structure. We saw some similarity in neurochemical actions. Do they also translate into behavior? In some animal studies have said yes. When animals were given methamphetamine, the monkeys or pigeons, and then they were given cocaine, methylphenidate, or diamphetamine, they produced very similar behavioral response. And these studies were in animal self-administration design. Interestingly, we can also examine these drugs in a very systematic manner before bringing them to a full-blown clinical trial in very controlled laboratory settings in humans. So we can see that whether these drugs compare in terms of pharmacology, compare in terms of their behavioral effects. And human laboratory provides a great setting to do that. We can examine their behavioral pharmacological effects, abuse liability, compared to other relevant street drugs. It's also a very useful platform to translate animal findings into humans, and we can get some translational idea. And many times the personality traits and other variables that influence these behavioral effects can also be systematically characterized and measured. And that's how human laboratory provides a very good venue to bring the problem from the clinic, carefully examine it, find solutions, and bring it back to the real world. So findings I'm going to show you today are human laboratory findings. So I'm going to show you results from 4 different studies. The first study used the drug discrimination paradigm and compared these 3 drugs, diamphetamine, methylphenidate, and methamphetamine. And this study was published a few years ago. And next 2 studies I'm going to talk about together, so I call them 2A and 2B. They use progressive ratio paradigm of drug self-administration in humans. First study examines diamphetamine. Second study examines methamphetamine. And at last, I'll talk about how personality traits such as inattention and hyperactivity influence behavioral effects of diamphetamine in humans. So let's begin with the first study. This was published a few years ago in Journal of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. As we all know, methamphetamine is a major drug that is abused on the street. It's a stimulant drug, and it has very high abuse potential. The prescription stimulants, diamphetamine, methylphenidate, we all know they are first-line treatment for ADHD, for narcolepsy with the different doses. And I also mentioned the prescription stimulants share their structural, neurochemical, and behavioral profile. At least the findings from animals have shown the similar behavioral effects. And I mentioned human laboratory provides a useful platform, and we're going to see how this drug compare in terms of the behavioral effects in human laboratory. Let me tell you a little bit about the methods that we use. We had 7 participants who completed the study. They were 20, 24 years old, recreational stimulant users. The training dose that we used was 10 milligram methamphetamine, which was administered orally. The taste drugs were different doses of methamphetamine, diamphetamine, methylphenidate, and triazolam. We also had a placebo as negative control, but triazolam was also used as a pharmacological negative control. It doesn't act exactly the same site where stimulants act. Stimulants act on monoamine transporters, while triazolam, benzodiazepines, we all know it, they act on GABA A receptors. So we wanted to see pharmacological selectivity in this drug assay. The depending measure being point distribution. The point distribution gave us an idea about drug discrimination, to what extent people can reliably tell placebo from methamphetamine. And I'll briefly mention in more detail what that actually meant. The subjective drug effect questionnaires is another thing, is another important dependent variables. We ask people, how do you feel after different doses of drugs? So simple questions in drug effect questionnaires. Do you feel good effects? Do you like drug? Do you feel stimulated? Do you want to take this drug again? In addition, we also use more standardized behavioral measures like Addiction Research Center inventory. It was a 49-question instrument with the true and false answers. And it was for the answers were divided into 5 different domains, one being amphetamine-like scale, benzene group, MBG. So it was very well-validated instrument. The other instrument we used was ARS, Adjective Rating Scale, and it was 32-question instrument divided into 16 questions each, 2 subdomains, the stimulant domain, stimulant subscale, and the sedative subscale. The stimulant subscale gave us an idea about how effects, did this drug produce stimulant-like effects. So that scale captured those effects. So that's the dependent measure. How did a typical session look like? In the morning, participants came to our lab. We measured their baseline vitals and got their baseline subjective measures in absence of drug. At 9 a.m., drug was administered, and then every hour for next 5 hours, they completed subjective rated questionnaires and point distribution. So let me talk to you more about what is this point distribution? What's the drug discrimination paradigm? The drug discrimination paradigm was comprised of 3 different phases: sampling phase, acquisition phase, and taste phase. The sampling phase was comprised of 2 sessions. Each session was a day. Each session took about 7 to 8 hours. So there were 2 separate days, sampling session. And each day we administered training dose 10 milligram methamphetamine. We call it drug A. For every participant, it's a different code. For some participants, it's a drug Q. Some other it was drug P. So it was randomized. But for simplicity, I'm going to talk about drug A here. So 10 milligram methamphetamine training dose, we call it drug A. And we told participants that today, you're going to receive drug A. Pay a very careful attention that how this drug make you feel. And write your experiences, your feelings, how this drug make you feel in a notebook that we are giving you. And make some careful observation every hour, as many times as you want. And do it again in the next session. So there are 2 sessions to carefully observe how drug A make them feel. Because after 2 sessions, the acquisition phase started. And during that phase, and then during 3rd phase, test phase, we said, we are not going to tell you whether you received drug A or the not drug A. You're going to tell us what you received by distributing 100 points of a drug A or the not drug A option. So how did acquisition phase look like? So in acquisition phase, they receive either 10 milligram methamphetamine, coded as drug A, or placebo, coded as not drug A. So in the morning, they received the drug. Entire day, they distributed point of a drug A or the not drug A option. And depending on how they felt, they referred to their notes and so forth. At the end of the day, they received an envelope. That envelope told them whether they received drug A or they received not drug A. So at the end, if actually they received drug A on that day, the point they distributed on drug A option were reinforced with money. And if actually they received not drug A, a placebo, then the point they distributed over not drug A option were reinforced with money. So this was an acquisition phase to train them, to really teach them how to discriminate between placebo and 10 milligram methamphetamine. And they had up to 12 sessions to correctly identify whether they received drug A or the not drug A. And subjects that correctly distributed 80% or more points in 4 consecutive sessions were deemed to acquire drug discrimination. And they were moved on to the test phase. So in the test phase, we gave them different doses of D-amphetamine, methylphenidate, methamphetamine, triazolam, or placebo. And they distributed points over drug A or the not drug A option, and the greater number of points distributed to either option were reinforced with money. There was no right or wrong answer. This was a test phase. We wanted to see that what they felt, how this drug made them feel. Was it like drug A or was it like not drug A? What was it? This experiment took up more than 30 outpatient sessions to complete. So it was a long experiment. It took several months to finish. And let me show you findings. So here, I wish I had PowerPoint. This is PDF files, so not showing appropriately. But let me show you in parts. On y-axis is 0 to 100%. So they have 100 points to distribute over drug A or the not drug A option. This y-axis shows the number of points distributed over drug A option. So when they received placebo, as you can see, they distributed very little points on drug A. So when they received placebo, they didn't feel like they received drug A or 10 milligram methamphetamine. Now, when they received methamphetamine, when they received smaller doses, they felt more like placebo, not drug A. As the dose increased, they're thinking probably it's more like drug A. And the highest doses, they correctly identified methamphetamine as drug A. By the way, this is 10 milligram methamphetamine, the training dose. Now, guess what happened after when we gave them D-amphetamine in the test phase? Anybody? You're right. Here's the dose response curve of D-amphetamine. Right on top of methamphetamine dose response curve. Very similar behavioral effect profile. And so was the case with methylphenidate. When they received these drugs, they thought they received drug A. They thought it was 10 milligram methamphetamine. The effects were very similar, very, very similar. We conducted family of curve analysis, and the slopes were identical. So was the minimum and maximum response, and slight difference in intercept because of their potency differences. But these drugs produce very similar behavioral effects at the clinical relevant doses. When we gave triazolam, it didn't produce methamphetamine appropriate responding. And that tells us this effect was pharmacologically selective. It's not that you throw in any drug and they would say it's a drug A. It's not that any drug that produces high was considered drug A. The assay was pharmacologically selective. And these findings also translate findings that people have observed in animals, now in humans, and informs our clinical judgment that how similar these drugs are. This slide and next several slides talk about subjective drug effect questionnaire. Both these scales are a stimulant scale of adjective rating scale that I talked about briefly before, and BG group, Benzedrine group of ARCI Addiction Research Center inventory. Both these scales gives us an idea about stimulant-like effects. And as you see, methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, methylphenidate, all three drugs produce very similar stimulant-like effects as captured by these two very well-validated instruments. And triazolam produced very little effect. When we asked, do you feel good? Do you feel good effect? Did you like these drugs? And participants said yes. Across different doses of three drugs, they had pretty similar behavioral effect profile when it came to good effects and like drug. Participants rated themselves being stimulated and talkative friendly right after the smallest doses of three drugs. And triazolam produced very little or no such responding. So does it mean that triazolam was devoid of any effect? We used a dose range that was just not producing any effect. It was clinically not relevant. Well, not really. We had this another subscale, sedative scale of adjective rating scale, which captured sedative-like effect. And triazolam did produce sedative-like effect as captured by this scale. And they also rated themselves being sluggish, fatigued, and lazy after several doses of triazolam. And as you see, as dose increased, response to methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, methylphenidate decreased on the scales. So what does this tell us? This tells us that methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, and methylphenidate produce very similar behavioral response that relates to their abuse probably. And triazolam does not. And this assay is very selective. It's pharmacologically sensitive assay that tells us that similarity of methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, and methylphenidate. Even further, I don't know to what extent this is clear. Probably it's not focused well. Is there a way to focus it? Anybody? That's how it is? Okay. What about this button? No. Okay. So the first column is methamphetamine. Second is D-amphetamine. Third one is methylphenidate. Fourth one is triazolam. Each of these graphs show the time course of effect. So on x-axis is pre, that is the response at baseline, and 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that is participant response after every hour for the next 5 hours. So how people's response change over time is what each of those graphs shows. And the y-axis, the first horizontal line is MBG score, which is morphine benzedrine group within ARCI, Addiction Research Center inventory. This scale gives us an idea of euphoric effects that drug produces. Second one is active, alert, and energetic. We simply ask question, do you feel active, alert, and energetic, and how they responded over time. And third one is willing to take again. Do you like to take this drug again? And the responses are shown here. As you can see, and these are different doses. So this, when you see triangles and squares, they are the two highest doses. So with two highest doses, you see all three drugs, methamphetamine, D-amphetamine, and methylphenidate, produce very similar euphoric-like effect, very stimulant effects on active, alert, energetic, and willing to take again. And triazolam produce very little or none of these effects. So this tells that the way these drugs are metabolized in our human body, in liver, is also very similar. The way they are chopped down by cytochrome P450 enzyme systems is very similar. Their time course of action is not very different. So not only their structures are similar, not only their neurochemistry is similar, not only the behavioral effect profile is similar, but the way our human body metabolizes these three drugs across time is very similar as well. And it's not moving. What did I do? Oh, okay. This slide shows cardiovascular effects of three drugs. These three drugs produce some enhancement in heart rate and systolic pressure, but it wasn't clinically significant. It didn't produce heartbeats more than 90, more than 100, or systolic pressure more than 148 or so, even after highest doses. So these drugs were very tolerable, and the profile was relatively safe for the doses that we studied at least. So let me summarize the findings. In our assay, methamphetamine did function as a discriminative stimulus and produce behavioral effects which are very prototypical stimulant-like effects. And D-amphetamine and methylphenidate fully substituted for methamphetamine and produced behavioral and pharmacological effects were very similar to that of methamphetamine. And this study was among the very first to use drug discrimination paradigm in humans to examine behavioral effects of prescription stimulants that relate to their abuse, to the extent that this behavioral effects, subjective discriminative stimulus effects, predict their abuse potential to an extent. Then that tells us that D-amphetamine and methylphenidate has abuse potential as high as that of methamphetamine. Now shifting gear and talking about next two studies. So far we saw that three drugs, D-amphetamine, methylphenidate, methamphetamine produce similar effect profile. But we don't know about their drug taking, how people take these drugs on street. Drug discrimination paradigm doesn't tell us much about how people self-administer this drug or their propensity to take drugs, at least under human laboratory conditions. And there are several different ways we can measure that. Free access procedure is one of them. They're commonly used for drugs like alcohol or caffeine or smoking, where people are given free access to drinks or to cigarettes and to caffeine drinks, and how much they take over time and to how many puffs taken were observed in a given session. So that's a free access procedure. Next two are the choice procedures, where participants sample a drug and then make a series of choice between placebo and drug, or placebo or drug and money, and see. We can see if drug is chosen more than money was chosen, or more than placebo was chosen, then drug has some abuse potential, or it has a reinforcing efficacy. Operant paradigms are more interesting because where drug delivery is contingent upon producing certain response, drugs are not just given by their choice, but they have to work to obtain the dose they sample. So that makes them more robust. So operant paradigms are very useful in that sense, and I'm going to talk about one of those measures. It's called progressive ratio schedule of reinforcement. It's an operant paradigm. So next two studies, I'm going to use that schedule, and those are studies 2A and 2B. In study 2A, we use this schedule progressive ratio to measure reinforcing effects of D-amphetamine, and second study uses paradigm to measure reinforcing effects of IV methamphetamine. And there are some procedural differences between these two studies, but they provide useful comparisons to see how reinforcing effects of D-amphetamine and methylphenidate overlapped. So let me tell you a little bit about progressive ratio procedures. They are very widely used in preclinical studies. They give us an idea about reinforcing strength or reinforcing efficacy. And in this procedure, response requirements, or it's called ratio, for obtaining each successive reinforcer are progressively increased. So people have to work higher and higher to obtain the next dose. And the endpoint is considered when subject ceases to respond, subject stop responding to take the next dose, and that's an endpoint. It's called breakpoint, or the other dependent variable could be number of doses they earn in the procedure. And several studies in humans and animals have shown that drugs of abuse dose dependently increase breakpoints in animals and humans. And but little is known on utility of this schedule to understand relative reinforcing efficacy of D-amphetamine and methamphetamine. So we're going to study that here. I'm going to talk about methods of both studies together. We had 8 participants completing the first study and the same second one, and this table gives an idea of the design. So it was 10 session study, and these 10 sessions were divided into 5 different pairs. Each pair was comprised of sampling and self-administration pair. The PDF file is not showing the lines properly, but let's look at here. So if this is a pair, then this is another pair, and this is another pair, so forth. So we had the first 2 sessions was a pair, which was a practice session. In the practice session, the participant got used to the behavioral routines, our tasks, and laboratory procedures, and so forth. And it also served as a medical safety sessions where we gave them at the medium dose of D-amphetamine or methamphetamine, and it didn't increase vitals to a certain degree. Then they were allowed to continue in the study, and all the participants continued the study. No serious adverse event was noted. So they continued further down, and if you pick one pair, for example, this pair, sampling and self-administration, during sampling day, so this both were on a separate day, by the way. Each session is a day. And on sampling day, participant receives a certain dose of D-amphetamine or methamphetamine. And they, again, wrote their experiences in the notes, how this drug made them feel. They answered questions, a lot of subjective effect questionnaires. And we asked them to pay close attention to how this drug made them feel, because in the next session, we won't just give them this drug. They have to earn that drug by working on a progressive ratio task. And let me tell you how that task went. So if participants wish to work on this task, they were required to click a computer mouse to a predetermined number of times to earn that drug, to earn the first capsule, which was like 1/8 of the sample dose. And by the way, we gave 8 different capsules in a sampling day. And we told them that all 8 capsules created your dose for today. So to earn the very first one, first capsule or first IV injection, they had to click mouse 400 times. And number of clicks required to earn each additional capsule increased by 200, such that the total they had to press 8,800 times to obtain entire dose. They had to be really, really determined to get that dose. But that told us that how reinforcing these drugs can be if somebody wants to work so hard to get that again. And some of the times we had placebo in, so we wanted to see they just keep on working anyways, or is it placebo where they don't work, and for different doses of drugs they do work on this task. And number of capsules for D-amphetamine or injections for methamphetamine earned was our dependent measures. And subjective drug effect questionnaires, the ones which I mentioned before, adjective rating scale, or addiction research center inventory, ARCI, or simple drug effect questionnaires, how this drug make you feel, and so forth. And the cardiovascular measures, heart rate and blood pressure. These are dependent measures. So that's our first slide. On our left panel, I'll always show the findings from study 2A, and right is study 2B. And on y-axis is number of capsules earned and number of injections earned. As you can see, after placebo, participants didn't work hard on this task to obtain the drug again. They didn't like placebo, looks like, so much. But when they received different doses of D-amphetamine or methamphetamine, they did work hard on the task and obtain the doses. But if you see, the behavioral effects is not too different across these two drugs. It's comparable. That tells us that D-amphetamine and methamphetamine has very similar reinforcing efficacy to the extent they make somebody take this drug. It looks like very similar. This and next several slides talk about subjective drug effect questionnaires, a stimulant scale, and as you see, D-amphetamine and methamphetamine produce stimulant-like effects in a very similar manner. Those response scores are very, very similar for both these drugs. When we asked, do you feel any effect after receiving this drug, and they said yes, and those response scores for both drugs were very similar. And so was the case for active, alert, and energetic item. Very similar dose response scores. Do they feel good effect? Yes, very similarly. So D-amphetamine and methamphetamine increased number of drug doses earned, as we saw in the first slide, in very similar manner, telling us about the reinforcing efficacy is very similar across these two drugs and produce very prototypical subjective effects on stimulant scale, on drug effect questionnaires, very similar behavioral effect profile like we saw in the first study. And reinforcing effects are very central to their abuse potential, that to what extent somebody wants to take this drug again. So to an extent that these two drugs show very similar reinforcing effects, tells us that the abuse potential for D-amphetamine is probably as high as that of methamphetamine if given in a similar manner. So summary so far. So far you have seen that D-amphetamine, methylphenidate, and methamphetamine share discriminative stimulus, subjective and reinforcing effects in humans. And to the extent that this behavioral effect dictates stimulant abuse, these drugs have abuse potential as high as that of methamphetamine. But there are some next series of questions we're interested in. That are some people more prone than other people to abuse stimulants? What are those variables? To what extent make those variables some people more sensitive than others to take stimulant medications? So in the next study, we examine how personality traits such as inattention and hyperactivity influence behavioral effects of stimulant medications. So that's a study 3. We examine behavioral effects of D-amphetamine in humans, and we examine how subclinical levels, not full-blown clinical level, but just subclinical levels of inattention and hyperactivity modulated stimulant-like effects of D-amphetamine methylphenidate. So there is some literature out there. They tell us that it's useful to examine the characteristic of people who non-medical use prescription stimulants, and those studies have shown that those people who are male, who have lower GPA, who are college students, who have attention problems, tend to abuse stimulants to a greater extent than people they do not have these characteristics. And self-reported ADHD symptoms, actually inattention and hyperactivity, they are associated with persistent use and abuse of stimulants. And this is independent of actual ADHD diagnosis. It's not full-blown clinical ADHD, but just inattention and hyperactivity component itself at subclinical level can make somebody more susceptible to stimulant abuse. So we examine carefully in controlled laboratory settings the relationship between this personality trait of inattention and hyperactivity and subjective effects of D-amphetamine. So this was a method. We had about 27 participants enrolled in our previous studies, and we classified them into a high score group or the low score group based on their responses on a rating scale. So it was an inattention and hyperactivity rating scale. People who scored 75 percentile or higher, they were classified into high score group. People who scored 25 percentile or lower were classified into low score group. And the oral D-amphetamine and placebo were the test drugs and subjective drug effect questionnaires, which you're familiar with now, and cardiovascular measures. And the session timeline was very similar, like I showed before. So here are the data. Participants who were in the high score group produced more stimulant-like effect on stimulant scale or active alert and energetic compared to low score group. So high score group were more sensitive to effects of D-amphetamine. They were also more sensitive to the effect of D-amphetamine when we ask questions, do you feel talkative friendly, do you like the drug? And they produced significantly higher response. Participants also rated themselves being stimulated, and their performance improved after several doses of D-amphetamine compared to them in those in low score group. But interestingly, this effect was specific because if you see there's a reversal, participants in high score group tended to have lower increase in cardiovascular measures of systolic pressure and diastolic pressure compared to low score group. So this effect was behaviorally selective. So I showed you the subjective effects of D-amphetamine were significantly enhanced in participants with high score group, high score in inattention and hyperactivity scale. And this rating was not actually ADHD diagnosis, and it was way subclinical. About 18 or more score in this scale was considered equivalent to ADHD diagnosis, and these people scored way lower than that. And that tells us that this inattention and hyperactivity, even symptoms, not reaching at the threshold of ADHD can make somebody prone to amphetamine abuse as long as subjective effects predict drug abuse. And this gives us an idea that along with the epidemiological findings, they important bearings on early diagnosis, symptom management, prevention efforts, and so forth in an individual with personality traits of inattention and hyperactivity. We need to develop a better clinical way to manage them. So I summarize all these findings so far. Findings from these 4 studies indicate that prescription stimulants, D-amphetamine, methylphenidate, carry abuse potential as high as that of methamphetamine. Personality traits such as inattention and hyperactivity make somebody more susceptible for stimulant abuse. So let me acknowledge my colleagues, collaborators, and mentors, E.D. London in UCLA, Craig Rush, University of Kentucky, Bill Stoops, and the funding support we received from NIDA, 2 of my R21 grants, ED's P20, and Craig's several R1 grants, and UCLA UL1 clinical translational support. They provided monetary support to make the studies possible. Now this was the finding. One last thing I want to talk about. So I'm here in ETSU. It's been a few months, and we are now extending this finding into more naturalistic setting. We wanted to see outside of human laboratory how we can examine prescription stimulant abuse and misuse. As you see that people who are in college, they tend to abuse prescription stimulant to a higher extent than people in the general population. We have easy access to college students. We wanted to see what's an issue on ETSU campus, probably other schools in Tennessee, or probably at the nationwide sample. We have written several grants so far. We submitted a U01 grant, which was close to $1 million a few months ago. Last semester, we wanted to examine prescription stimulant abuse in a nationally representative sample. And there was a brief intervention, the online intervention we designed to address this problem. Two other grants I have submitted as a PI to Tennessee Board of Regents and RDC Major Grant, where we were aiming to examine prescription stimulant abuse in college-going population, including medical students, pharmacy students, healthcare professions, nursing, and the undergraduate population. we ended up doing a small study before we wrote this larger grants in the last few months. And let me briefly show you those findings. They are initial findings. They were conducted at ETSU, and they're about non-medical use of prescription stimulants among college students. And we conducted a small survey and a focus group study to examine in a quantitative and qualitative manner about people's tendency to use and abuse these drugs. So in our survey, there were 29 undergraduate students. It was a small feasibility study, and they were in a health behavior class. They completed a 44-item survey. This is demographic, the gender, and race. There are more Caucasians in never user than ever user. So we had two groups, 21 never users and 8 ever users in groups, and there's no difference in age or GPA. And here are the results. People who were ever users, people who ever used prescription stimulant in non-medical fashion in their life, they also tended to try more illicit drugs, such as marijuana or other cocaine, other drugs. And these users also had more close friends who were misusing prescription stimulants. Ever user also tended to be a member of Greek organization compared to never users, and they had psychiatric conditions, so major depressive disorder, to a significantly greater extent than never users did, and this is statistically significant findings. And the reasons for the non-medical use of stimulants were to focus study, to lose weight, to get high, to get more energy, to experiment athletic for fun or party or whatever reason. And they did experience a range of adverse effects: loss of appetite, insomnia, racing heart, irritability, upset stomach, headache, so forth. And we had another study. Within that study, we also did a qualitative component. So we examined students' perception, views, and opinions about prescription drug misuse on campus, what they thought other people are abusing these drugs. And two major themes came out in their discussion. One was misconception of harm. Mostly people thought that these drugs don't produce any harm. It's all right to use or abuse these drugs. They don't have any negative side effects. They are very safe. They're FDA approved, so it should be fine. I can take medication that was prescribed to my friend, and it's all right to use it, and during exam times to abuse it. That is a misconception of harm, despite their admittance of range of negative effects these drugs are producing. The another thing was social norm. They thought everybody's using it. As a matter of fact, only a small portion uses or misuses this drug. And they found that a range of people uses it as friends, and they create a social network. They also found created some apps, and there are different online ways to communicate who had this drug and how to obtain. So there is a systematic structure on campus to get this drug if they want a night before exam. So summarizing these findings, non-medical users of prescription tend to be more likely to self-report illicit drug use, have higher rates in psychiatric conditions. They're more likely to be members of Greek organizations and have experienced several adverse effects. Yes, they have misconception of harm. And we would recommend the greater involvement of counseling center to address this NMUS on campus, better dissemination of information about availability of mental health support group, and some awareness campaigns that tell them more about negative consequences of these drugs, and probably helping them coping strategies to reduce their stress before exams, some other alternative ways to handle the stress and anxiety. So I collaborated with Nick Hagemeyer, College of Pharmacy, Robert Pack in College of Public Health, Marian Littleton, Ron Carrico, and the ADAPT team. And I thank College of Pharmacy and College of Public Health for making these studies possible. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming and listening to this presentation. I appreciate it. And sure.
In the progressive ratio did the participants know that they had to work for 400 subsequent?
No. All they knew that they had to work on this task. We cannot tell them, otherwise they will start counting, and they'll say, oh, all right, just few more. I have to just press few more, and then I'll be done. we cannot tell them that these are the predetermined number of time. They were made aware that in order to obtain the drug or dose that you sampled yesterday, you may have to work on this task. No, we had only one participant at a time. Thank you. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
So it sounds like what you're saying in your study is that instead of using stimulants, that one might consider use of non-stimulant medications that also have indications for ADHD as a way to try to, because the people that are going to be at high risk for abuse are the people that also would fit the criteria, quote unquote, even though a lot of young people are saying they know what to say, they go into the doctor's office.
They know, that's
They now
true.
get prescriptions in 10 minutes.
Right.
They read off the symptoms, but our population is even most high risk for abuse. So I'm just wondering about in the adult population, especially, because that's the population for which we have the least double-blind placebo-controlled
Kind of trials, right.
studies for ADHD. Are you going that far to recommend utilizing things like
Statera,
anticholinergic agonists,
guanafacine. Um, that's a great point. That's a good question. That's a good way to think about it. Probably just move outside of classical dopaminergic mechanisms. See, focus more on norepinephrine transporter. Atomoxine and Statera is just norepinephrine transporter inhibitor. It doesn't act on dopamine system at all. So that would be a good way to do that. I don't know. It's not a first line drug, and there is some argument that it doesn't produce efficacy in reducing ADHD symptoms. It's not as highly efficacious as stimulant medications are. So we have to weigh the risk and benefit and see, go by individual patient to what extent this person is likely to use or not. And we have some information out there that make them susceptible versus not. So I think it needs some careful evaluation. But many of the studies are not in ADHD diagnosed patients. So the issue is not about ADHD patients being treated, about this drug being diverted to their friends and other people who don't have ADHD symptoms. And some of them do self-medicate. Even though they don't meet ADHD thresholds, they end up misusing. Many times they smoke as a self-medication way, or snort. You're so right. They crush the tablet and snort. That's why Vyvanse is pretty relevant there. Even they crush and snort, they don't receive D-amphetamine by the route. It has to go in blood circulation. In RBC, Vyvanse is metabolized into L-lysine and D-amphetamine to produce good effect.
I think the elephant in the room here is that stimulants make people happy. So people like to be happy. Physicians try to get happy.
Pursuit of happiness, right.
And the rest of it is largely not, I don't know whether they have ADHD or not. I don't know whether they're
I agree.
but they are happy.
They're happy. Right. Idea is not that we treat unhappiness. Idea is that we treat, at least we try to treat and manage their symptoms that relates to impulsivity, as we have DSM-5 and DSM-4 scaling. Impulsivity is a domain, inattention, hyperactivity around the domain. And we try to help them focus in their academia, try to reduce impulsivity, and so forth. So I agree, there is some happiness component, and that kind of adds to compliance, but probably it also adds to abuse potential as well.
One other thing,
Yeah,
whether the patient says they're impulsive or says they're inattentive,
that's a great point.
it's not as valuable as a chrono CBT or an absolute or intellectual measurement.
Completely agree. Absolutely agree.
Get that from conversation.
I agree. Completely agree. As a matter of fact, I have found that there are several systematic ways that people get trained online to fake ADHD symptoms in psychiatrist's office. Because we don't have objective measures. Like you say, it needs a neurophysiological EEG and other neurophysiological measures to. Connor scale is good, but again, Connor scale asks questions and they fill questions. CPT as well. CPT is a very good measure of attention, and it's a very good objective where you're right. Thing is, when we try to give people modafinil, amphetamine, and see whether that increases performance in CPT, it's not reliable. It's not very many studies have shown that in a CPT task, there's a dose-dependent increase in focus and attention. It's not been reliably shown.
Not prognostically, maybe, but as a diagnostic, it's discriminating.
That's a good point. Not for treatment, but for diagnosis. Is ADHD versus non-ADHD. CPT can be a good measure, I agree. I'm sorry, I'll get to you. Absolutely.
One other thing I was thinking is when you were looking at methamphetamine, one of the things that when you were looking at methamphetamine versus triazolam, one of the things that struck me as kind of interesting, from a clinical perspective, if you give somebody 2.5 milligrams of amphetamine or D-amphetamine, you're going to have very mediocre responses. People are not going to notice it much. And then even at the low doses of triazolam that you were giving, not terribly low doses, they were noting sedativeness and sluggishness. It's interesting when you compare the two, low-dose amphetamine to triazolam, the awareness of a drug effect is apparent across the board, low dose, whether it's sedative or stimulant. So they notice that they have a drug effect, but it's not until you get into the more clinically active dosages that they note the stimulant effect and the impact of the stimulant effect.
You're so right.
Particularly. So, Jonathan said much of the rest is nonsense, but what is not nonsense is, amongst the substance abuse population, chasing dissociation is a classic thing that they're looking for. And whether that dissociation comes from stimulants or sedatives or opiates, they are not particularly discriminatory, as some of your other data show. People that tend to be involved in substance abuse are interested in dissociating, whatever it may be. They run out of everything else, they'll go out in the garage and huff gasoline.
They do. You're right. A lot of people have different coping mechanism. They like to experience and self-medicate, probably even themselves not fully being aware of. They have tried smoking, they've tried alcohol. People with attention span issues, they tend to have higher marijuana use. Even a lot of people have higher cocaine use. The higher score group that I have shown, all of them had higher marijuana, higher cocaine use, but they just didn't receive statistical significance, but numerically they were higher. And a lot of other epidemiological larger studies have shown that they tend to, so I agree. They would take a lot of different drugs that no matter produce what kind of effect, but some psychological effect they have. I agree, they tend to. But at the lower doses, these people don't tend to go for very, in a lower range of dose response. They tend to go at the higher range of dose response curve, where effects are very apparent, whether it's a stimulant or sedative. So at that point, they know. Many times, their tendency to use and abuse other drugs is about access, or just trying to find something when somebody is in problem. I'm sorry, can I get her question real quick? Sorry. Yeah. Sure. Right. Mhm. Good. I like your questions. Inattention hyperactivity skill. Enjoy your questions, by the way. Let me go one by one. So your first question is why we use halcyon, why we use that as a pharmacological negative control than other options, Stadera, nicotine, other ones. To answer your question, when we set up an assay that hasn't been fully done in humans before, we need to make sure that we replicate some of the findings that have shown that a living being, a mammalian, can separate these drugs. And a lot of animal literature have shown that halcyon and drugs that act on GABA system shows a better separation of neuropsychological effects. So that was the idea of using a pharmacological negative control, as it's not just producing high. These drugs are known to produce high, halcyon, other GABAergic drugs. So that was the whole idea, that use establish the neuropharmacological sensitivity of drug discrimination assay and use a drug that is pharmacologically very distinct. And that would give us an idea of pharmacological specificity of drugs. If we use Statera, then we can't say much about pharmacological specificity of the assay, because amphetamine, methylphenidate, methamphetamine, all three drugs act on norepinephrine transporter. So does Statera. So that would give us very little information on pharmacological specificity. So to address the question and establish an assay with very pharmacological specificity, that was the goal. And using drugs which are known to be abused and have very different pharmacology. So it's not just producing high, it's produce high to have very similar effect by acting in particular site in brain. So that was the reason. The second question is about methamphetamine given intravenously and d-amphetamine orally. And in first slide, we saw a bigger response to methamphetamine and low to some of the subjective response. That's a very good point. These drugs are different and don't produce exactly same response. As a matter of fact, between those two studies, some time was elapsed. So what happened? Let me show you the slides. Here, I gave an example in method section that we use 400 to 1100 range of mouse presses, totaling 8800. So that was for d-amphetamine. But the one big issue was that if you look at it, the separation was not as high from placebo. So my goal was to design an assay where we obtain enough separation. So part of the reason being we can use this assay for medication development. We can examine a drug that reduces reinforcing effect of d-amphetamine or methamphetamine can be a useful medication to be tested in clinical trial. That would give us some idea that these drugs do reduce the abuse potential of drugs. But if I use this assay, the kind of design we had, there's a very little room for shifting those response curve. So I wrote this R21 graph to indicate that why not we design a very sensitive assay that shows very large separation from placebo to drug. And now we have room to shift those response curve. So what you see here is the methodological changes that leads to this response. As I told at the beginning of showing both studies that they are similar in their procedure, but there are a lot of differences in procedure, but I'm showing this data just for the sake of comparison to give an idea. Here the progressive ratio was similar, both the studies, but the parameters were slightly different. Here we reduce the minimum response requirement for 400 to about 100 or 200. The reason being that people just press for nothing to get 1 or 1.5 capsules placebo. Sorry, not 400 to 800. So we increased the response requirement for the first capsule, but they had to work so hard to obtain 1. So they didn't even work hard to obtain placebo. And then we reduced the maximum response requirement so that they would probably work to obtain methamphetamine doses. So that's how you separate their pharmacological profile. So the magnitude of change you see is not pharmacological, is procedural. Response requirements were lower. That's why you see greater effect and better magnitude for any pharmacological drugs to reduce it. So this provides a good assay now. We could use this to examine whether any drug shifts the dose response curve to down. So that was the answer of second question. And when you see some effect changes, they are not very significant. You see the error bars are large. We had only few patients here. So even though you see slight changes in responses, they are not significant because the error bars are higher. Your last question was on scale. And if you notice, we grouped them to two extremes. We didn't separate groups we didn't do the median split. We used the top quartile, 75% or higher, and the bottom quartile to really separate these two groups. And we didn't use any in between 25 to 75. So the top quartile and lower quartile, high score, low score group, and we compared them. It's inattention and hyperactivity rating scale. We took this questions from DSM ratings, and we created this scale. And it was used in laboratory for several years. So we had this data to examine retrospectively. So we ended up using that. But a majority of those questions were pointed or were taken from DSM criteria. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. That's a good question, and that question can be answered by designing a research study. We can make some hypotheses. One hypothesis would be that people who fall into subclinical category could respond to non-stimulant medications given across several weeks, months in a chronic nature, and see if those non-stimulant medication effectively handle this. Strattera, bupropion, guanfacine, some other drugs can handle that subclinical level of symptoms so that we don't have to give them full-blown stimulants, or that kind of prevents them going for alcohol, marijuana, or smoking different routes, illicit drugs, to self-medicate. But again, these are hypotheses, may not come true. We just have to actually conduct a study to test that hypothesis or answer that question. Very, very good questions. I enjoy that. I'm sorry, you were asking.
Yes. In terms of alternatives to methylphenidate and dextroamphetamine, a number have been mentioned, but surprising to me, no one has mentioned modafinil or armodafinil.
Yeah.
And early on, the research on modafinil suggested that it was very low in abuse potential, but subsequently, research suggested, in fact, that it did have abuse potential, including that of Norovircal.
Yeah.
So I was wondering to what extent you were interested in looking at modafinil compared to methylphenidate and dextroamphetamine, and also in terms of a spectrum of abuse potential with the other drugs considered as well that are used to treat ADHD, rather than just focusing on pharmacological specificity, but on abuse potential as a rationale?
That's a great question. That's a great question. Modafinil needs some more attention. Our modafinil, new visual, needs some more attention. More research needs to be conducted to answer those questions. But yeah, like bupropion, modafinil tend to have a little bit lower abuse potential than full-blown stimulant medications. And some drug discrimination studies have shown that people who are trained to separate cocaine from placebo and then given modafinil, they didn't produce responding as high as that of cocaine. Dose response was very low, a little bit. So modafinil doesn't have abuse potential as high as other stimulant medications, but it has some utility. But again, modafinil is a very, very interesting compound. Being low efficacy, it is more like we can think of it as not as a partial agonist, but it's again is a low efficacy drug, and low efficacy drugs tend to be selective in certain population. For example, I'll give you an example. We did a study with modafinil, and we tried to see the performance on CPT, particularly in methamphetamine abusers. So our goal was, is modafinil effective in reducing methamphetamine abuse? Charles Deck and several other people have done some study and shown that modafinil could have some effect in reducing cocaine. So we want to see in methamphetamine. And as such, modafinil had no effect. On its own, didn't have much effect. When given in combination with methamphetamine, it reduced its effect to some extent, but not. But then we separated this group. We separated in terms of the baseline use of methamphetamine, low frequency users and high frequency, people who use methamphetamine a lot, people who use methamphetamine very little. People who use methamphetamine for longer and use larger doses for longer amount of time, they tend to have, they erode their dopamine neurons. The nerve terminals are eroded over time by overexposure of methamphetamine to dopamine transporter again and again chronically. It's been shown. Nora has shown that in several articles. Modafinil in those people was very effective. Similarly, Carl Hart in NYU, Columbia actually, he showed that modafinil and some other drugs are more effective when given to people who are sleep deprived in terms of producing greater effect in cognition. Some other people have shown this separation too. These low efficacy drugs somehow are as such not effective for general population, but certain population who is in greater need, they are more effective. So more research needs to be done and see that are they really more effective for people who are having real problems with ADHD, real intense ADHD now, then only modafinil shows some effect and it acts as a full agonist as opposed to low efficacy drug. Some research needs to be done. I don't think so modafinil will be as highly effective as D-amphetamine or methylphenidate for general population of ADHD. A smaller subgroup of ADHD with more severe ADHD symptoms, modafinil could be effective. Again, this research question needs to be answered by actually conducting a study. But good questions and very stimulating discussion. I enjoy this audience. Thank you.